So it is my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Ramona Alagia. During her keynote address, Ramona will discuss gender equality, gender equity, and gender-based violence. She will explore a number of issues, including how we define gender, as well as differences between gender equality and equity, and how these are connected to gender-based violence. Ramona will also look at ways that social workers and social service workers can identify and redress gender-based violence. Ramona is deeply engaged in examining gender-based violence issues from the standpoint of survivors of childhood sexual abuse, sexual violence, and intimate partner violence. Her applied work is trauma and resilience informed. Her research identifies structural barriers and contributes to helping to develop anti-discriminatory policies and practices for women and children living with and disclosing gender-based violence. Ramona is currently running a large-scale study on the impact of the Me Too movement on sexual violence disclosures in Canada. The third edition of her co-edited book, Cruel But Not Unusual, Violence in Relationships and Families in Canada, will be released in this upcoming 2020 second part of the year. Ramona was interviewed by the college for its upcoming perspective. When asked what led to her interest in the field, Ramona replied, and I quote, "Once you know something, you can't unknow it. In over 15 years of working in children's mental health and group homes, I started to see the real crux of the problem. We were assessing these children and youth with behavioral disorders, mood disorders, and personality disorders when many of their issues were rooted in developmental trauma. They often had histories of sexual abuse, physical abuse, and exposure to domestic violence. I also wondered why there were so many more girls and women in treatment. I couldn't ignore what I was seeing in services and in my own practice and the very serious consequences of gender oppression." Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ramona Alagia.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for that warm welcome. I'm delighted and honored to have been invited to do the keynote on this very special day, given it's the 20th anniversary. And I've been associated with the college in the past 2 decades since I became a social worker. And I am just so honored to be here, to be representing social workers and social service workers in their practice in this very important topic. My name is Ramona Alagia. I currently work at the Factor in Montage Faculty of Social Work at the University of Toronto, where I teach and do research in gender-based violence. Thank you again. I have a few objectives for today. And thank you for reminding me of all those experiences I had that brought me to this work. That interview seems so long ago. We've talked about how we have that pre-COVID brain and then the post-COVID brain. There's been some memory lapses, so thank you for bringing that forward. I also want to mention that my very first social work supervisor was Glenda McDonald. So I had the great gift of having been trained by her at Sunnybrook when I was working in adolescent services there. So today, what I'd like to do, as mentioned before, is review just what does gender equality, gender equity, what those two terms mean, but also to understand the relationship to gender-based violence. When I was first invited to speak here, it was before the onset of COVID. And so this has really kind of shaped, and it's very, very timely that we talk about gender-based violence in a pandemic. So I will talk about then how do we mobilize ourselves as social workers and social service workers in an anti-violence movement in a pandemic. This is my conceptual model. This is the way I started to think about today's presentation and bringing the pieces together when they can be complex. And so first of all, I do want to speak about what does gender equality mean, then gender equity, and how this pandemic is exposing and actually exacerbating existing social and economic inequalities. In gender equality, we are striving for everyone, regardless of gender, race, class, age, ability, sexual orientation, to have access to the basic human rights that are accorded everyone across this country. And by 1916, women in Canada were given the right to vote. However, not every woman in Canada was given the right to vote. It was only in 1985 that Indigenous women were accorded that freedom. But equality means having access to things like voting, owning property, access to the job market, access to health care, equal access to all of these rights, including the right to live with freedom from fear. Well, equity is a different issue in the sense that equity are those resources that are accorded people to be able to maintain and sustain their equality. Those resources are what allow people. So let's say, 1916, later in 1985, for women to be able to own property and have access to that. Also means that they have to have access to being able to work, and to work for fair wage and equal wage, and to have the same opportunities. Because without working and without access to capital, owning property is not possible. And so my conceptual framework here really takes those two issues of equity and equality. And what I see and what I know now and what I've seen over the last several decades is that we as women have not achieved equity. We've been given equality, but not equity. And how do I know that? Gender-based violence is clear evidence of gender inequality and inequity. Because we know in a patriarchal society that there's a hierarchy with male privilege at the top, and though equalities are accorded, equity isn't actually achieved, so that we see that gender-based violence is the outcome. And we have increasing rates of gender-based violence. So let me set the context first, because gender is something that we are redefining. Time, just this past spring, devoted a whole issue to the science of gender. And what does that mean? And that binary notions of gender are outdated and they're constraining, and that these new notions, binary, non-conforming, a diverse gender expression, is creating a more expansive and inclusive terrain for gender equality and equity. We see the more encompassing use of pronouns. And I mentioned toxic masculinity because it's important to note that under traditional gender norms and socialization, unfortunately, and combined with patriarchy, we see some expressions of masculinity, hypermasculinity, toxic masculinity, connected with violence, and often at the root of gender-based violence lies this notion of toxic masculinity. So let's do a little review first, before the pandemic, and what we know in terms of violence against women globally, and from the World Health Organization. Consistently, over the past number of years, we see reports that 1 in 3 women girls around the world experience physical and sexual violence. In Canada, the vast majority of police-reported calls for domestic violence are for female victims, that's a legal term, but survivors of domestic violence who suffer significantly more serious injuries are at greater risk of death. And in fact, the University of Guelph produced findings a couple of years ago that 8 out of 10 victims of domestic violence in Canada are women. In Ontario, over 90% of reported and investigated child welfare cases in Ontario for exposure to intimate partner violence see the adult victim or survivor as the mother. So who comes into services in terms of suffering gender-based violence are predominantly women, and we see every year over 17,000 women and children entering the shelter system. As much as I'm honored to be here and delighted, I have to say I don't think I've felt this nervous since my dissertation when I had to defend my doctoral dissertation many years ago. So I come from the premise that domestic abuse and sexual violence is a gendered issue. The facts and figures are there. It does not mean that we do not see male victims and survivors of abuse and violence, but the numbers show that it's predominantly a female problem, with most clients coming into services being women and children and girls as well. But not only that, it is a gendered issue that involves women and girls and children up to a certain age, but we need to use an intersectional lens to understand the complexities of who are the most vulnerable to gender-based violence. And with this lens, we see that racialized women and girls, Indigenous women and girls, and Two-Spirit people, women with precarious immigration status, trans women and non-binary people, LGBTQ community members, women with mental health issues, substance abuse and addictions issues. And we can't forget that often this is the consequence of enduring violence and trauma. Women living with disabilities, senior women, and women and girls in general are the most vulnerable. So we need to paint this very diverse, complex picture to understand who are at the most risk. And so, to this end, we see that actually Canada has a strategy to prevent and address gender-based violence. This strategy was developed in 2017, and it came out of the Status of Women's Office with distinct pillars to suggest ways of prevention and intervention. And in this document, gender-based violence is more broadly defined than we've ever seen it, to include as well as physical, societal, structural, emotional, sexual, but now also cyber abuse and those technology-facilitated forms of violence that are being used against women. And so in recognizing this and creating this national strategy, the federal government hands this over to each province so they can, at their discretion, interpret and implement for their province these pillars and how they should look in delivering service. However, Ontario's response, once the Doug Ford progressive conservative government came into power, was to actually dismantle the domestic violence roundtable that was created in 2015. It was established in order to be able to translate the national strategy into provincial goals and outcomes, and it contained membership of the most marginalized groups of women in Ontario. Disbanded in 2018, as well, this government also defunded the increases to sexual assault centers across the province and services, given that there was a surge, and we'll talk about this more a little bit later, but a surge in sexual violence disclosures and reports since the Me Too movement. Okay, so we need to know this context, what's happening in the country, but also in the province, to understand our potential to respond or where our hands are tied as social workers and social service workers in redressing the problem of gender-based violence. So that was before, and this is now. And so knowing what was happening in the landscape of Canada and this province, Ontario, in terms of gender-based violence, we now turn to what's happened since the pandemic. And we all know that on March 11th, the World Health Organization declared a global emergency with COVID-19. And with that came measures to keep people safe. And it's sort of an irony that what was needed, and still today we're practicing, is social isolation, physical distancing, of course the mask wearing, the hand washing, and all those things that public health authorities say that we need to do. But within a month or so, the Ministry for Women and Gender Equality very soon saw reports across Canada of a 20 to 30% increase in the rates of gender-based violence, and especially domestic violence. It's called the shadow pandemic, these rising domestic violence rates. And there are maybe ways to explain this, and sort of the two most commonly referred to ways of understanding this is what I call the tip of the iceberg theory, that in fact these rates have been at these levels for a long time. The pandemic and the conditions of the pandemic have really just unmasked what was already there. And or the social isolation theory, that one of the main tools of perpetrators of any kind of interpersonal violence is to isolate their victim. And here was created for safety a natural condition of social isolation that could be used to further distance women, to abuse them, but also to cut them off from supports and services. So those rates could actually be an increase because of this, and of course the stressors that come along with living in these pandemic conditions. I think it's probably a bit of both, but I think the pandemic has really served to unmask and reveal what we've known for a long time and put it out into the public domain. Another trend is we see that child abuse rates have increased, that Kids Help Phone reports over 100% increase in calls and contacts since April 2020, and in physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, they're seeing a third of an increase in those particular calls. Children are more at heightened risk if they're in care, they're at home, they are more apt to be on their devices and on their computers. So this isolation is also leading to online luring and sexual exploitation, and that the human trafficking risks have really increased. Colleagues of mine in Durham region told me that their youth in care, in residential treatment and so forth, made an exodus when the the safety measures came into place, because it's, already a confining, restricting place that, for their safety, but they really didn't want to be locked down in a group home and went out on the streets. And again, their vulnerability to being picked up by human traffickers was so heightened. And unfortunately, you even see ads for young sex trade workers who have said they've tested negative. They've had COVID-19 testing and are negative and COVID-free as a way to attract. So amongst those trends, and I'm just going to divert for a little bit, and this will make sense in a moment, the other trend we've seen that's been reported by the Law Society of Ontario is an increased rate of divorce, or calls asking and inquiring about divorce. Now, isn't that interesting? At the same time, the courts, the family law courts, were closed down, so cases couldn't be seen except for the very most critical, in which then they were seen remotely. But we're now dealing with this backlog. But I mention this because at the same time, what's converging is Bill C-78. And if you're doing any work with families who are separating, divorcing, if there's high conflict issues, you need to know about this, that this amended Divorce Act, which was supposed to come into effect June of 2020, is now being delayed till March of 2021 because of COVID, actually and I'm just going to focus on the two sort of main amendments that we would be most interested in, is that they really put the interest of the child at the center so that these custody disputes and parenting plans and so forth are done with the best interest of the child in mind, but also they included and redefined or defined more clearly family violence so that this dynamic could be taken into account when parenting plans were constructed, when custody arrangements were being determined. So that this also included a definition of family violence that doesn't need to meet criminal charge threshold, but rather that there is reason to believe that there has been family violence. So I'm going to put a pause on that. We'll get back to it in terms of what we need to do. But this is now coming out in 2021 and will have an impact on the rising rate of divorce and then this backlog that we have accrued. I think it's time now to talk about the gender gap, which we've been living with for a long time. I always do my research before these presentations because I can't believe the numbers myself, but I triple check. Women's wages are still well below men for the same work at about 76 cents to a man's dollar for the same work. And I don't know if people saw this in the paper the other day or social media, but female physicians in Ontario are paid significantly less than male physicians. And when we think this is an elite, highly educated, highly empowered group of women who still cannot get wage equality, wage equity. I find that fascinating. So you can imagine if you're in unstable work conditions, precariously employed, with contract work or part-time work with no benefits, it's still shocking to me that this is continuing. The time studies still continue to show that women do the majority of domestic responsibilities of childcare and emotional labor, domestic labor at home, all unpaid work. And then for women who also work in the paid workforce, they're coming home to do the double shift. So these time studies show this is who's taking up the slack once. So even in a double career household, women are still picking up that double shift. And what intersects with this to really create inequitable conditions is the inadequate access to high quality, affordable daycare. We're supposed to have a national strategy for daycare, for childcare. We've still yet to see it decades later. Oh, I like to show this because it kind of gives you a sense of just how far we've come. If you can see in the corner there, you'll see that this cartoon was sketched in 1985. And what it says is a census taker at the door saying, and the woman responding, yes, this is a two-career household. Unfortunately, I have both careers. And this has huge advancement implications for the workplace, for all of us as social workers, social service workers. That's why we often see so much of the front lines being populated by women as you go further up the management ladder, the middle, senior management, and we see fewer and fewer women. It would be like the triple shift to run organizations or be politically involved when you see what women are taking on as the burden of work, both unpaid and paid. So I'm showing that 1985. Oh, here's another. I love magazines. I love going to check out lines. And I, this past month, saw in Maclean's, and this caught my eye, we see a mother pictured with her two children with the caption saying, "Staying home with them is safest, even if it costs a huge chunk of my career." So my point is that the pandemic is widening this gender gap. Because any rational person or any family that's struggling during the pandemic and needs to sort out who's going to do what, and with access to high quality, affordable childcare being woefully inadequate and constrained now during the pandemic, and with women doing more of the precarious work, contract work, part-time work without benefits, who is more likely to stay at home with the kids if they need to be homeschooled, they can't go out, if there's a second wave or in lockdown again, or taking care of elder parents. But of course, the person who's making less money and who is the most precariously employed. And that becomes, again, so this exacerbation of the social and economic inequalities in this pandemic is something we need to be paying attention to as we're working with children, families across the lifespan in terms of what women are facing today in Canada. We also have the hidden pandemic. We know that essential service workers, frontline workers are predominantly female in healthcare, in social services, and other services. We saw that the long-term care devastation was the result of institutional living, but also that personal support workers had to move from institution to institution because of how poorly paid they are, mostly women, in order for them to be able to make enough money to put a roof over their heads and provide food for their families. So again, and they're often living in marginally paid, because they're marginally paid, they're often living in overcrowded situations, housing where we see what's called the hot spots in Toronto in terms of high transmission rates. Sexual violence and exploitation has increased. And as I mentioned before, we saw the rise of the Me Too movement, which raised awareness of the extent of sexual violence. And services became flooded. Statistics Canada reported in 2018, by the end of 2018, that there was a huge rise in police reports of sexual violence across Canada. That was partly money then that was earmarked to go to these services to respond to sexual assault survivors and their need for service that Ontario took away from the services here. But this did result in new policies. I'm going to throw another one at you. Bill C-65 is an amendment to the Canada Labour Code for workplace harassment and violence. Again, that is being delayed. It was supposed to be rolled out this summer till January 1st of 2021. And this is a good thing. This is where addressing gender-based violence is seen to then tighten workplace policies so that women and everybody can work in safety in their workplace. But it also extended to having employers and colleagues identify and respond to anyone they felt might be in a domestic violence situation or experiencing violence at home, so that they were given instructions to develop work plans on how to respond to that. So we saw some movement, but we need to, again, let's pause on this and see where and when is this actually going to be enacted. It cannot be lost in this pandemic. Unfortunately, COVID-19 creates more opportunities for sexual offenders to perpetrate. As I mentioned, children, vulnerable children online. But we're also seeing women who are needing to use sex for survival and are in vulnerable positions, and whereby we're hearing about cases where their demands for sex are put on them in lieu of rent, lodgings, food, basic needs. We are finding that sexual assault survivors are less likely to go to hospitals after an assault for fear of catching COVID-19. And sexual offenders are using masks as disguises, which interferes with identification later on. So now this norm of wearing a mask also becomes protection for offenders. And again, this has not changed much, that the majority of sexual assault survivors are women, and it's still pretty stable in terms of child sexual abuse, that 1 in 4 girls, 1 in 6 boys will experience sexual abuse by the age of 18. We're also in what's called the double pandemic of racism, and with anti-Black, anti-Indigenous racism on the rise. And again, is this an uncovering of what's existed for a long time, or is this actually a rise in rates of individual racism, but also kept in place by systemic racism? We only have to look at the most egregious case of racism in Canada with the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, where they were neglected, the police response was inadequate, non-existent, and their murders went on for a long time until the inquest. And we've had tragic situations of women who have been responded to for mental health issues, losing their lives. Regis Korchinski-Paquette in Toronto, Chantal Moore in New Brunswick, just a few of the lost lives. But in the course of this, we've seen this rise of social movements being galvanized and mobilized so that Black Lives Matter, Idle No More, and as I mentioned before, the Me Too movement. We haven't seen this kind of rise in social movement activity since the 70s. So we can use that, and I think it's an important energy for the momentum that we can garner as social workers and social service workers to remember those roots of our social movement days. And finally, structural violence are those policies and laws that keep violence in place and gender-based violence at the levels. We'll go into this some more as we look at what we can do to change the landscape of what's happening in our province around gender-based violence. And I like to see this as a movement towards what I have coined this term, radical resilience. I do resilience research. I'm really, really excited about it. And I think we can use these ways of being radically resilient towards creating an anti-violence movement. I'm borrowing from Brené Brown, who's a vulnerability researcher, but also a social worker, who says, "The dark does not destroy the light, it defines it." And how I see social workers and social service workers today is that beacon of light. If we are aware and if we mobilize and galvanize, we can take this moment and embed it in an anti-violence movement for long-lasting change. We cannot go back to the way things were when they were not working. When I talk about resilience, we always get into these kind of debates, academic debates, theoretical debates, what is resilience? And, one of the ways that I understand it, it has multiple entry points. We often think of resilience as the growth that happens in the face of adversity that's individually contained, that people have it or they don't, or it's somehow internal to them, when in fact, it's an interaction with the environment, and that we really need resilience, resilient environments to create this change so that people will be resilient. It has to be in interaction. It's not one or the other. And some resilience researchers say we are only as resilient as our environments are resilient. And that's our call to action, is to start changing that environment. How do we do this? Well, in my view of radical resilience and transformational change, I've looked at sort of the organizational characteristics and features that organizations and agencies that rise above and rise to top have, and what we can do and learn from that. And I'm going to harken back to good old systems theory, talk about the 70s, where if we reframe and see crisis as an opportunity for change, something has happened. This pandemic crisis is not our first rodeo. If you remember, we had SARS, we had H1N1, and did we have enough masks and PPE for this current, tsunami of a pandemic? No. Did we learn from those two pandemics? We didn't see those crises as telling us something as a society, but we, as social workers and social service workers, can see that yes, crisis presents danger, threat, we need to put in safety, but at the same time, the flip side of that is opportunity for change, for growth. And how we do that is by standing united. This is not the time to stand or to be divided. It's connectedness at a time, which is even more important when we've been asked to socially distance, isolate. We have to make more efforts to connect. So today is a great example of continuing on. We found technology and a way to connect as a collective. We need to do proactive planning, not this reactive. Remember I said, this is not our first pandemic. We need to be solution-focused versus problem-saturated. It's so easy for us to, identify the problems, get them down in detail, analyze them. We're really good at that, but we also have to do equal time towards what are the solutions. And then constantly evaluate what are the positive changes that we need to be taking as a formula and embedding them in our organizations and our practices. And the one way that we can do this, that we often say we don't have enough time to do, but we have to make this time, is to have that ability to reflect and to value reflection. I think we're at the point, and if we're not, we should be soon, that we need to be intolerant to the current conditions. We need to reflect. We also need to have faith and hope. Those are characteristics that are important, but a belief that change is possible. I know with this audience, it's a funny thing to say, let's make sure we believe that change is possible, because this is our business, right? But if you don't believe this change is possible, it's not going to happen. And this means creating new vision for going forward, and that's revisioning. This is the time to pull out those mission statements, to pull out those guiding values and principles for our organizations and for our practice. Say, are these still relevant? Do these need an overhaul? What is the new vision? And how do we get there? And advocacy and activism are an important part of that. And we've got some good social movement stuff happening. So the use of these and the power of these social movements should not be underestimated. And I know that the field is sometimes divided between those who do clinical practice and those who do more advocacy and activism. And again, we should stand united at this point in time, not divided, because both are equally important. Both have a place. This is not an either or. And we have social workers and social service workers who can work in these different domains with a lot of skill and a lot of insight. And I just started to list the movements that we can take part in and be supporting and being more active in. So getting back to those, policies that I mentioned before, the amendments to the Divorce Act, the amendments to the labor laws, we got to make sure they happen, and they happen in the way they are intended to happen. Being involved in training. Now, we're really good at getting trained. We've gone to fabulous trainings, love trainings. It feels like it's indulgent. But I'm saying we need to be doing the training. This is where we need to be educating judges, lawyers, physicians, healthcare workers, other allied professionals on gender-based violence, how we identify it, how it's systemically and structurally kept in place, and how we dismantle that. We need to be taking the lead on that. And in situations where I've seen social workers go in and do trainings, the results have been fantastic. We need to advocate for legal reform. We know that women do not do well in court, whether it's around, as a victim survivor of violence, in divorce courts. We need to be looking and advocating for legal reform and calling it out when it's unfair and creates inequitable circumstances and conditions. And I gotta mention it again, we gotta advocate for universal childcare. It's the only way to start to get women more active in the workplace. Finally, I'm going to talk about the importance of staying grounded. And in this day and age, and with what's happening with the pandemic, it's easy to get lost in everything, the uncertainty, the fear. And this is really when we need to increase our rational thinking. And that part of the brain that gets activated when there's danger, when there's threat, when there's fear. Yes, we need to have that. That's part of an evolutionary process that then puts us into places that are safe to decrease the threat and the danger. But once that's happened, we need to increase rational thinking. Fear Fear-based decision-making usually results in poor decisions. We need to find ways to increase that functioning of that part of the brain that is going to hopefully get us to where we want to in a logical way. We want to choose fact over fiction, and that's not my words, that's the World Health Organization. Got to stop listening to rumors, make sure that we're getting our information from credible sources. We got to keep connecting, even in the face of this isolation, physical distancing, and all the things that we need to do to keep safe in a pandemic. And I really want to emphasize the self-care. Practicing self-care is not a selfish act. In fact, not practicing self-care is probably an unethical act, because if you're not taking care of yourself, then how are you taking care of your clients, be they individuals, families, communities, agencies, and how are you then modeling for them how they need to practice and can practice self-care? And that can come in the form of, there's all sorts of things out there now, mindfulness, deep breathing, which I was doing a lot of on my way here, managing our expectations, but also practicing self-compassion and compassion towards others. Because this is big work that we're taking on in creating an anti-violence movement in an era of a pandemic. But it's also an opportunity to not go back to the way things were, especially when they weren't working. And crises, and when they repeat, third pandemic, the universe is telling us something. As a planet, is this the result of climate change? As a society, with the rates of racism and sexism and all those other isms that are really pulling us down, do we want to return to those conditions? This spotlight on these issues is our time to continue to shine a light on it, and to go forward and move forward to create better conditions and ways to address gender-based violence. So I just wanted to say I'm coming to the end, and on that note, and something that's happened before or since I was invited to do this talk, I will be with my colleague at the university, Dr. Fuller Thompson. We will be running a social worker and social service worker survey 2020 across Canada. It's never been done before, because we want to know how you're doing. We're going to ask about past adversities, resilience factors, and we've even added now a section around COVID-19 impacts. We're calling it the Health and Well-Being of Social Workers and Social Service Workers in Canada survey, and the results will help to inform health and well-being strategies and supports for all social workers and social service workers. So I'm hoping at some point in time later this fall, you'll see across one of your listservs or come across your email a survey. I hope you take the time to answer it. It will give us a really good idea of how everybody's doing and how we need to move forward in terms of the profession and as a collective, because we can't do it individually. We can't each do it on our own. And I know that sometimes well, I'm just one person. How am I going to make these changes? Yeah, you're not going to do it as one person, but we are going to do it as a collective. And that's where the most powerful and radical resilience resides. It's in the collective. So on that note, I think I'm going to open it up to questions. Is that what's going to happen now? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ramona. At this time, I will invite those who would like to submit a question to do so. You can just scroll down from where you're watching the video. There's a call for questions form which you can complete, and I will then be able to read the question out to Ramona. So Ramona, we actually have a comment here, so I'll read that to you now from a member, Rochella Watson. So her comment is, I agree we need a call to action and need to educate those not in the VAW sector. She mentions that the Assaulted Women's Helpline can offer training. We also are a great resource. The volume of calls has increased during COVID-19 for the helpline and the seniors safety line. Anyone can call anonymously. It's available 24/7 in over 150 languages. So that was Rochelle's comment.
And I really appreciate that, because that is in the spirit of working collectively to share this information, to verify what's happening in different domains. And I agree that we really need to take this out of one or two sectors and bring it broadly into all the sectors that our social workers and social service workers are working. Thank you.
And I'm just going to maybe take a moment and ask a question from me that I thought through over this presentation, which was really insightful, Ramona. So I know you talked about, as a collective, this idea of mobilizing ourselves, specifically in the midst of the pandemic. So the concept of radical resilience, having that reality of COVID-19. So can you give us some of your thoughts on how someone would be able to go about, taking part in that radical resilience?
Mm-hmm. Well, I've actually seen this starting to unfold in some of the agencies that I've been working with during COVID, where maybe supervision and time for reflection pre-COVID was not happening as regularly as it could be. Get busy, lots of work on our caseloads, and that seems to get pushed to the margins. But since COVID, and with the use of virtual platforms, some agencies have now created that space because they're not working together on site. And in the spirit of creating and keeping community going, and this intentional act of, we need to carve out some time now, people are able to get together on these virtual platforms a little bit more regularly and easily. Like even today, coming down here, I was like, oh my gosh, I have to get dressed. I actually, have to figure out my transportation. We do have some more time now to be able to focus on those. So I've seen agencies already reconfigure this time for reflection, because it's got to be done in the collective and in being mindful of how important connection is during a period of isolation. More efforts have to be made. So then we're more intentional. And things have taken off where some agencies have now invited other like agencies to join that supervision, group supervision, reflection time. So it's growing. But it's because these spaces have been created that can be now filled with different activities, collective activities. So, that's the long answer. The short answer is it can't be done by one person, but it can be done as a group call to action. And every agency can define that in the way that, but it means revisiting, re-looking at, re-examining, and deciding what are going to be the priorities and how the revision is going to look like.
Thank you, Ramona. We have a few questions. So the first one that I'll read out loud is from Vanita Puri. She mentions, thank you to Dr. Elagia for your wonderful presentation. How can social workers help to build resilience and social solidarity with cultural communities who may not have access to knowledge and resources about Canadian laws on family violence?
Yeah, that is such, and especially with the repealing of settlement houses and all the funding that helps to settle newcomers to speak in cultural groups. I think that's a very good question. Again, is that something in revisiting and revisioning mission statements that agencies can start to take on and partner with other agencies who are working with those cultural groups? In many ways, and I'm not telling you anything new because this phrase has been used and overused, but we work in silos between sectors, across agencies, with different mandates, with mandates that might even contradict or cause tension. And now is the time to stand united and to look at those and see where are the partnerships where you may not be able to, as your agency, address that, but you may know of an agency that you can pool your resources together. I know all agencies are starting to relook at how they're doing things. And the fact that you can identify that as an important issue means you already have your direction for a call to action. Now it's finding those resources, and we have to use creativity, resilience. There's lots of research on resilience, on what makes for a resilient person or a resilient system or a resilient organization, but creativity is definitely in there. This means thinking outside of the box and coloring outside of the lines, turning things another way and looking at them much differently. So again, as a collective, standing united, not divided, and bridging those silos, I would say are sort of the first steps to that kind of resilient growth.
Thank you. We have a comment or question from member Sybil Allen. They say, my concern about the profession of social work is that the lens of the profession remains white and privileged. So they've asked what your thoughts are on that. As a result, the level of activism is not likely to be radical, as white women are the ones who hold up structural racism, and we need to unpack this as a profession. What are your thoughts on that?
And this really speaks to that intersectional lens that we constantly need to be using and looking through. You know, certainly I was aware as I was doing this and looking at the most vulnerable to gender-based violence, the list of vulnerabilities, and though through different times in my life I can say that I experienced some of those vulnerabilities, I do know one thing, and that my white skin privilege helped me to rise above. And in a racist society, non-white social workers, social service workers, clients are disadvantaged. I completely agree. And so we then look at our mission statements that include our hiring practices, that include looking at who's sitting in management, who are we hiring, what kind of systemic or structural issues are at play that lead to these outcomes of having predominantly white women. And this was the problem with second wave feminism. It's very exclusionary to intersectional, differing social locations, multiple identities. And so again, this looking at why this is happening and how it can be redressed will then be translated into your hiring policies, what kind of supports are there for folks who don't seem to be able to get the same advantage in getting the opportunities, but we do need to populate this profession in a much more diverse way.
Thank you. We have a question from Sue Ellen. With those living rural, remote distance can be and is another factor for those at risk, being able to reach out for help. How is this going to be remedied in policy changes?
Well, we definitely need more funding. Now I'm going to kind of put myself out here, and is it possible that this current provincial government, and with the softening of Doug Ford's heart, I don't know if it's real, but something's happening. Is it possible to start campaigning and lobbying for those areas that are under-resourced, underfunded for what they really need? Or maybe going to Chrystia Freeland. I don't know. Maybe she can talk some sense into him. But there's an opportunity here. Things are not working, and even the politicians are starting to back away from some positions they took pre-COVID. Can we wedge ourselves in there? Because really what you need in remote and rural areas are more resources, more accessible resources. And the reason they're not there is because they cost money, and usually more money. How can we as a profession campaign for that? And again, not working in silos of urban, rural, remote, competing for the same tiny pool of money. that, again, we need to stand united and see if there are ways we can campaign and lobby with governments to adequately resource these areas.
Thank you, Ramona. We have a comment from Nancy Friedman. Thanks for a great presentation. I wanted to share some initiatives to collaborate on addressing these challenges, such as Safe and Together Institute, as well
I know it well.
as well as Safe and Unrested research underway at U of T.
Yes, Safe and Together, and there are some great programs out there for service delivery. Thank you for bringing that forward. And this is an example, and I don't know how many people we have online here, but when we get the collective, we're sharing resources, we're sharing ideas. And this is what I'm seeing happening in some agencies now who are, as I said, finding those moments to reflect, these kinds of trainings and workshops, and then expanding them to other agencies to include bigger groups. Because it's this sharing of resources, ideas, thoughts, or just time to reflect. They're going to be the bridge builders to these silos that we're currently living in. Thank you for that comment.
So we have a question, I believe, from Rena. In my experience, one of the challenges in cultural communities is connected to who is providing settlement services in cultural and ethnic organizations. The vast majority of the staff do not have social service work diploma or background on social services. Therefore, the settlement industry heavily relies on others to provide information on VAW laws, which are often not culturally competent or appropriate. So that was her comment.
Yeah. I agree. We need to have the right people in these jobs to do what needs to be done. It parallels, and we shouldn't be surprised, the devastation of sending in police to do mental health work. That's our domain. That's what we know how to do best. So it's not surprising that it's come to these tragedies when police are trained to intervene with force and authority and very little flexibility for negotiation. They want that problem to be over and to be over fast. They objectify. We need to get in there as mental health practitioners trained to do this. And I bring this parallel to the example that this member has brought, because you're not having the right people do the work that needs to be done. So it's not surprising then that things don't get translated to clients in the way that they should be. Again, it's lobbying. I imagine that the reason that social service workers aren't being employed in these appropriate positions for them is money, would be my guess. And we, again, need to be lobbying for more resources.
So I'm just waiting to see if there are any other questions that will come through momentarily. So we'll just give it a minute or two just to see if there's
Sure.
anything else that comes through.
I'm sure it's been a long morning for most people.
So it doesn't look like there's any other questions, so thank you again, Ramona.
Thank you for having me, and good luck to everyone as you forge ahead and find the way forward. Take care.
You don't get to leave that quickly. So, Ramona, I'd like to thank you for sharing such an important, informative, and timely presentation with our membership. I appreciated your thoughts on the role that members play in addressing gender equity, gender inequality, and gender-based violence. I really appreciated the way you spoke about the push and pull of our current environment and situation, embracing our rational thinking, and for me, the power of possibility. So thank you for that. Thank you for your call to action, for standing united and modeling the way. I think it was great and it clearly resonated with our members. I think it's fair to say that we're also all very excited about your future work.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So on behalf of the college, thank you. And in lieu of a speaker's gift, the college will be making a donation to the We Matter,
Thank you.
which is an Indigenous youth-led and nationally registered non-profit organization committed to Indigenous youth support, hope, and life promotion. And thank you very much. So that concludes our 2020 annual meeting and keynote address. As a final reminder, there is a link to a post-event survey available on the college website for you all to complete. Following today's event, we encourage you to complete this survey, at which point you can enter your personal information and receive your certificate of participation while you fill out and print it for your records for your CCP. Thank you all for your participation this morning in this different platform, and please continue to stay safe and enjoy the long weekend. Thank you.